Hello, I'm Sumay Jaylan, and you're watching Playback, Tier 2 World's weekly showcase of our best stories from around the globe. Coming up, we look back at the life of the Soviet Union's last president, Mikhail Gorbachev, who died on August 30 at the age of 91. In Pakistan, authorities struggle to keep the economy afloat as infrastructure is damaged and millions of people are displaced by severe monsoon flooding. And in Ukraine, fears of a nuclear disaster are growing as UN inspectors say the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant has been compromised by nearby fighting. Mikhail Gorbachev, the last president of the Soviet Union, has died at the age of 91 after a long illness. Gorbachev was instrumental in ending the Cold War, but his plans to change the Soviet Union's political system and economy led to its breakup.
Mikhail Gorbachev was the Soviet Union's last president. He introduced glasnost and perestroika, meaning openness and restructuring. They were policies which led to huge changes how the Soviet Union was governed and ended censorship. And he was credited with instigating other changes that led to the end of the Cold War and the removal of the Berlin Wall. In 1990, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his leading role in the peace process between the East and the West. As late as November 2014, Gorbachev made memorable statements on current foreign affairs.
Bloodshed in Europe and the Middle East against the backdrop of a breakdown in dialogue between the major powers is of enormous concern right now. The world is on the brink of a new Cold War. Some people are even saying that it's already begun.
He was lauded by Western leaders, most notably Margaret Thatcher, Britain's Prime Minister in the 1980s, who said Gorbachev was a man she could do business with. After several summits in Iceland, US President Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev signed an agreement to destroy stocks of intermediate-range nuclear-tipped missiles.
Today, on this table before us, we see the fruits of hope, evidence of what candor and realism can accomplish. We have dared to hope, Mr. General Secretary, and we have been rewarded.
Another headline decision was pulling back Soviet troops after Russia invaded Afghanistan to prop up a communist-led government. But as the Soviet totalitarian state was being dismantled, his authority declined. Communist hardliners held him under house arrest for 3 days in 1991. Gorbachev was released after a mass protest in Moscow. But after the attempted coup, Boris Yeltsin replaced him as president of Russia. The Soviet Union was dissolved on Christmas Day 1991 as Gorbachev resigned the presidency. He stayed active politically but spent more time with his wife Raisa. She was also feted in the West as a symbol of change. She died of leukemia in 1999. Many Russians, however, were openly hostile towards Gorbachev, blaming him for the demise of the Soviet Union and the loss of Russian influence. In 1996, Gorbachev ran unsuccessfully against Yeltsin. Later, he supported Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev, but in the past few years criticized the lack of democratic values of Russia's leaders. He'll mostly be remembered as the man who helped change world politics at the end of the 20th century.
Officials in Pakistan have said this year's severe monsoon season will cost the country's economy at least $10 billion. 33 million have been displaced, and the National Disaster Management Authority says more than 3,000 kilometers of road and 162 bridges have been damaged by floods and landslides, making the aid effort even more challenging. A third of the country is underwater, and more than 1,100 people have died. Kamran Yusuf reports from central Pakistan.
Sanaullah Khan has taken shelter on the roadside. His house nearby is inundated with water, yet he is taking the risky journey back home.
This food I am supplying to my elder family members back in the village. The government has not provided us any assistance. It's only the local people who have come to our rescue.
Sanaullah's father has taken shelter on the rooftop of what remains of his house. He is too old to be moved from there. That is why his son brings him food regularly. This part of the Charsadda district is the most affected. We saw water stretching 10 kilometers on both sides of the Peshawar-Islamabad motorway. One village of 250 houses behind these trees is completely underwater. Nature has not been kind to these people. Floods have forced them from their homes and they have taken shelter in tents in the middle of the road. To add to their misery, the weather is unbearably hot. Finding a makeshift tent is a challenge for some.
We have suffered many losses. Thankfully, we are alive, but our livestock has perished and our house has been destroyed. There's no facility here. It is too hot here and I have not been given a tent yet.
Luckily, there is no loss of life in this area, but that is the only bright side.
I have 50 acres of land where I grew vegetables and other crops, but now all of them have been destroyed by this flood. What will I do now? Everything is gone.
We found in our travels the devastation caused by floods to the sugarcane fields. These are testing times for people. They not only face immediate challenges, but the magnitude of the devastation means there is a long road to recovery.
A team from the United Nations nuclear watchdog says the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine has been compromised. The team visited the facility on Thursday. The plant was seized by Russia earlier in the war and has since become under regular shelling, sparking fears of a nuclear disaster. The initial checks of the plant are now complete, as Sarah Morris reports.
The international team of nuclear experts arrived at the Zaporizhzhia power plant not knowing how much access they would get, nor how long the Russians controlling the facility would let them stay. After being escorted around the site by Moscow's officials, the inspectors said they'd gathered valuable information.
It is obvious that the plant and the physical integrity of the plant has been violated several times. By chance, by deliberation, we don't have the elements to assess that. But this is a reality that we have to recognize, and this is something that cannot continue to happen.
The head of the mission also announced some of his team would stay at the plant in an attempt to stabilise it.
I worry, and I will continue to be worried about the plant until we have a situation which is more stable, which is more predictable.
Just getting to the power plant was treacherous. This explosion happened about 5 kilometres from the facility, an hour before the inspectors arrived. Both Russia and Ukraine accused each other of carrying out the attack to sabotage the mission. And the convoy was held up at a checkpoint for 3 hours before it finally negotiated its way through. The power plant has not only come under regular shelling, but has been disconnected from the electricity grid several times. That's a problem because the 6 reactors at the site need a constant power supply to stay cool. The job of the nuclear experts is not just to assess if the facility is safe, but to also check on the welfare of the Ukrainian technicians who are working there under duress. Russia is promising to cooperate.
We're doing everything for this plant to be secure, to function safely, and for this mission to be able to implement all its plans.
But those who live and work near the plant are taking no risks. Ukrainian emergency services have been training for a possible nuclear disaster. Inspectors hope in time to establish a permanent presence at the plant, but the situation is diplomatically delicate and nothing is guaranteed. Sarah Morris, TRT World.
U.S. President Joe Biden has signaled that he wants to make gun safety a key issue in the November midterm elections. Biden has been visiting his home state of Pennsylvania, where he's pushing for stricter controls on assault rifles. Traditionally, Pennsylvania has been seen as a key battleground state. Yasmin El-Sabawi reports.
This is one of 3 trips U.S. President Joe Biden is making to the state of Pennsylvania in the span of a week. It's a major battleground state with tight races for the governor and the Senate in this November's midterm elections. Biden is here to push the Democratic Party's legislative agenda.
It's time to hold every elected official's feet to the fire and ask them, are you for banning assault weapons, yes or no? Ask them. If the answer is no, vote against them.
With the Safer America plan, Biden is proposing Congress allocate more than $35 billion for crime prevention projects, including the recruitment and training of 100,000 police officers.
When it comes to public safety in this nation, the answer is not defund the police, it's fund the police. Fund the police.
With his approval ratings still hovering under 40% since the spike in petrol and food prices earlier this year, Biden's presence may not necessarily be seen as an asset to Democrats in local races around the country. And with the former president now the subject of an FBI investigation, Biden urged Republicans not to attack members of law enforcement.
And now it's sickening to see the new attacks on the FBI, threatening the life of law enforcement agents and their families for simply carrying out the law and doing their job.
Biden is expected to be back in Pennsylvania on Thursday. Yasmin Al-Sabawi, TRT World.
It's been 1 year since the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan. In the race to evacuate civilians and Afghan allies, Washington prioritized the relocation of CIA-trained Afghan special forces. But many have been accused of war crimes. Soraya Lenny traveled to Paktikar province to speak to survivors of those crimes who say the soldiers should face trial.
Ahmad Jan is a broken man. The death of his son has left him with few words.
He was laying here when I arrived.
But Ahmad is also angry. He says his son was murdered and he knows exactly who's responsible. US-trained special forces.
They told me not to go over there. My son said, "Don't go to that side of the house. He had been shot."
In July last year, the Taliban was advancing across the country, and night raids by special forces had become more frequent.
People used to worry because before a raid, they would put explosives in front of people's doors and detonate them. They threatened everyone, saying, "If you leave the house, we will shoot you." This affected everyone, and even if we went to the commander to complain, he would say, "No one can come after me or question me."
Faisal Rahman's family, including Zohre, live next door to Ahmad Jan. The raid was so loud, Zohre's two daughters went to the window to see what was going on.
The firing was intense. I went upstairs. I saw them both lying face down. They were warned by a laser, but they didn't realize what it was, and they were shot and killed.
Witnesses say, like the killing of Ahmad's son, this shooting was also intentional. Afterwards, unit members came to inspect the dead girls.
They came upstairs with a flashlight. There was one wearing glasses and the commander, Shaheen.
Families say the operatives belonged to a US-trained strike force unit. There were at least 4 trained mostly by the CIA and all accused of extrajudicial executions and enforced disappearances.
The war on terror was not fought in the cities, it was fought in villages like this one, far from cameras, far from prying eyes, and according to locals, far from accountability.
TRT can confirm the unit has been relocated to the US. Sources say despite the allegations against the units, the US prioritized their evacuation during last year's hectic withdrawal.
I want to ask the US, when it was welcoming these people, were there any rules and regulations? If there were, they have violated those rules and therefore they are now your criminals. We want these people to stand trial like any other people who commit abuses would.
These families are not naive. They know the carnage of war better than anyone. But they contend justice and accountability should apply to all, and not just a select few. Soraya Lenny, TRT World, Zaporizhzhia, Afghanistan.
When Iraq's Mosul was overrun by Daesh in 2014, thousands of Christians were forced to flee the city. Many Christian places of worship were destroyed under the terror group's rule, but city authorities hope a new reconstruction project will inspire some to return home. Malik Fouda has more.
2 of Iraq's biggest churches are under reconstruction. They were destroyed when the northern Iraqi city of Mosul was toppled by Daesh in mid-2014. Under Daesh's occupation, minority populations, including Christians, were terrorized and persecuted. Christian infrastructure was destroyed. Hundreds of people were murdered. thousands fled the city of Mosul.
The reconstruction of this church by UNESCO is a message to Mosul's Christians who live around the world outside of Mosul and Iraq. It's a message of peace to them, and it invites them to return to their city and take up their roles in the reconstruction of the city and its places of worship.
Iraq's population is predominantly Muslim, but Muslims and Christians have always coexisted there. Prior to the U.S. invasion in 2003, Iraq was home to around 1.5 million Christians. This number has now dwindled to an estimated 300,000. 80% of the Christian population in the country are Chaldean Catholics, which are strongly affiliated with the Roman Catholic Church. There are also other sects in the country, including Orthodox, Assyrians, and Armenians. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, there was a sharp rise in violence against Christians. Once Daesh took control of much of the country's north, many fled Mosul to neighboring countries or the safety of other cities. Currently, only a few hundred Christians reside in Mosul. They're eager to rebuild not only their churches, but their communities.
We were born in Mosul. I mean, our great ancestors were in Mosul. So Mosul is our city. It's important for us to have this reconstruction so that people can come back. So the priority for us is to reconstruct and restore them, to bring them back to what they used to be.
The Restoration Initiative, funded by the United Arab Emirates, seeks to relieve these communities of the hardships they've experienced in recent years.
These are ancient churches, and their state has a great psychological impact on people's return. However, churches are not the main reason that Christians are not returning to the city. It is almost the 5th year since the liberation, and you still see rubble everywhere. The city needs to be reconstructed to allow returns.
Construction work on Al-Sa'a and Al-Tahira churches are expected to end in late 2023. The effort could perhaps offer hope for the future. Malik Fouda, TRT World.
In Baghdad, after weeks of protests, supporters of Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr stormed the city's green zone on Monday. After dozens of people were killed and 350 injured, Sadr spoke, ordering his supporters to go home. Within an hour, peace returned to the streets. The violence followed Sadr's announcement that he was quitting politics. Claire Harriott has more.
Supporters of prominent Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr fired rocket-propelled grenades into Baghdad's green zone as weeks of peaceful protests turned violent. Powerful militias that fought Daesh are now making Iraq's political crisis extremely volatile. They're the armed wings of Shia political factions who are taking aim at state security forces. The army appeared to return fire. Al-Sadr's sudden resignation from politics on Monday catapulted Iraq into violence and chaos. But on Tuesday afternoon, he called on his followers to stand down.
We said okay to peaceful protests, but now even that is not okay anymore. I don't want peaceful protests either. What did the people do between yesterday afternoon and now that they should suffer like this? They are living in fear with this gunfire and mortars. You want to get rid of corruption by killing people? No, my friends, this is not acceptable.
Al-Sadr derives power from his ability to mobilise and control his large following. On hearing his words, his supporters immediately withdrew from the Green Zone. He leads Iraq's strongest political faction, the Sadrist movement. It's allied with Kurdish and some Sunni Muslim parties. It's opposed by the Coordination Framework, which is an umbrella bloc of mostly fellow Shia groups, backed by Iran.
Iraq has been ruled from the beginning after 2003 with consensual democracy because we have different ethnicities, Arabs, Kurds, and Sunnis divided between Arab Sunnis and Arab Shia and the Kurds. It's it's impossible for one political ethnicity to gain majority in parliament to rule the country.
And now, no one's running the country. Iraq has been without a functioning government for 10 months. There's gridlock because the Coordination Framework thwarted al-Sadr's attempts at forming a ruling coalition. On Tuesday, a mass funeral took place for al-Sadr supporters who were killed during Monday's clashes in the Green Zone. The recent violence is a setback for a country that's trying to recover after decades of conflict, and there's no clear path to a solution. Claire Heriot, TRT World.
Power prices in Europe continue to hit record highs, and as winter approaches, authorities are warning of a full-blown crisis. Already protests have erupted in many of the world's richest nations as consumers struggle to absorb the increases. Let's take a look at the socio-economic impact the crisis is having and what measures governments are taking.
For dialysis patient Dawn White, soaring electricity prices in Britain have become a matter of life or death. The 59-year-old's kidneys are failing. She needs to use her dialysis machine 5 times a week to purify and pump blood around her body. Without it, she will die.
And every time they put the prices up, although I can reduce what we use in the house to almost nothing, I cannot adjust what this uses. This is standard, this is it. There's no way of saving on this.
And there's little relief in sight. The UK energy regulator has announced that prices will jump by 80% in October to around $4,000 a year. After more than 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, the massive disruptions to global supply chains, Russia's war in Ukraine, the food and energy shortages, the drought in Europe and rising inflation, now even those in the richest parts of Europe are feeling the pinch. In Belgium, Spain and France, workers have gone on strike. They want salary increases to cope with rising prices. In the UK, activists have called on consumers not to pay electricity bills from October. British unionists are holding rallies demanding cheaper food, power and rent caps, salary increases and more taxes on the wealthy. The protests are putting pressure on governments, and the European Union chief has called for an emergency intervention.
The skyrocketing electricity prices are now exposing, for different reasons, the limitations of our current electricity market design.
But Europe's electricity supply dilemma will not be solved overnight. And ahead of what's expected to be a cold and expensive winter, European governments are imposing band-aid measures. Germany imposed heating limits with bans on heating of private pools and outside lighting for buildings and monuments. Some public buildings will no longer be heated. The French government wants to cut energy consumption in 2024 by 10%. Shops will have to turn off illuminating lights after closure and lower temperatures. Spain has also imposed limits on indoor heating. Lighting of shop windows and monuments will also be banned. Finland's campaign encourages citizens to lower indoor temperatures, take shorter showers and reduce time spent on devices. And Danes have been encouraged to take shorter showers, use a clothesline instead of dryers and to run households more power efficiently. While governments are trying to cushion the price rise and shield consumers, geopolitical uncertainties are making controlling prices and supply difficult. For people like Dawn White, this comes down to being able to afford home dialysis and a longer life, or moving to a local hospital where she will receive fewer hours of treatment, which could see her condition deteriorate rapidly. Mubin Nasir, TRT World.
Adıyaman, a city in one of Turkey's southeastern provinces, hosted an art exhibition showcasing its rich history. Adıyaman was home to many civilizations over the years, and the exhibit explains that cultural legacy. İlyas Avcı has more.
A city with a history dating back to 40,000 BC. Adıyaman is an open-air museum exhibiting the past. But over the weekend, contemporary artworks transformed it further.
The Komagene Biennial is being held for the first time this year. It takes its name from this region where it is arranged. The Kingdom of Komagene is an empire that did not live very long. It lived for 200 years, but lived in peace, and in this context, it is very valuable.
The biennial goes by the motto of an imaginary civilization. And by bringing together artists from all around the world, it aims to emphasize common cultural heritage.
Appreciating the scenery or appreciating the art? Well, why not both? 53 artists from 23 countries have gathered here in Adıyaman to show off their pieces at 6 important landmarks around the city.
Most of the artists came to Adıyaman, felt the atmosphere, and created their pieces by the inspiration they got from the land. Some even stayed true to ancient rituals.
Most of our artists produced their works here. The statue of Antiochus V, behind me, was carried by the artist on his back, in the same way as the historical artifacts were brought to Nemrut.
The exhibition returns in 2 years, but with or without the artworks, Adıyaman still has so much history to explore. İlyas Avcı, TRT World.
Well, that rounds up your week of news here on Playback. Stay tuned to TRT World for the latest stories.